starting today and in the months ahead, we hope to bring this information directly to communities like yours and those that we know will be facing increasing flooding in the years ahead. So thank you again for being part of this. So I want to start here. All of us on this call really appreciate that we are in many ways a coastal country. We have a third of our population living in coastal counties. We have 3 million people living within 3 feet of the high water mark. You can scan our coastline, and there will be very few stretches of shore that aren't dotted with highly developed areas like this. This happens to be Salem, Massachusetts, my hometown, but it really could be almost anywhere along our coasts. The patterns are the same. We have historically concentrated housing, business, and industry near our shore. Today we know that sea level rise presents these highly developed coasts with risks. We face a clear current risk, that of increased damage from amplified storm surge. We face a long-term risk, that of permanent inundation of certain areas later this century and beyond. But with sea level rising at an accelerating rate, it begs the question, what happens in between? What does that change look like? How does it play out? And what should we be planning for as coastal communities in the next several decades? This report takes a hard look at this question for the U.S. East and Gulf Coasts and outlines the central and potentially really disruptive role that tidal flooding is poised to play. And for that matter, the tidal flooding is already playing. So this photo is from 2 days ago. It's of the banks of the Potomac. It was taken by a colleague of ours on her way to work in D.C. This week, amidst what will be the highest tides of the year in some locations, tidal flooding is expected to disrupt business as usual in areas of Portland, Maine, of Queens, Annapolis, Charleston, Miami Beach, and lots of places in between. And I want to take just a couple of minutes before we dig into the findings of the report to just talk about what that disruption can look like. This is Annapolis, Maryland, capital of the state, home of the U.S. Naval Academy. And as many of you probably know, some of you may know up close and personal, Annapolis is coping with seas that are rising faster than the global average and is seeing tidal flooding on a regular basis. It's a low-lying city, and it faces regular disruptions to downtown streets and parking from extremely high tides. It has seen a more than fourfold increase in tidal flooding since 1970, which makes it among today's most frequently flooded East Coast cities. Today, the popular city dock, some of which you see here, floods 40 to 50 times a year during high tides. This is one of the stories that we wanted to tell in our report. And here, I've just included a quote from Lisa Craig, Chief of Historic Preservation for the city. If anyone happened to catch Christopher Joyce's piece on NPR yesterday, which touched on extreme tides in our report, you would have heard Lisa say this. So let's go to Jamaica Bay, New York City, and specifically to the Broad Channel neighborhood of Queens. This is a photo that was taken just this past Saturday, and it's really fairly typical of the new and full moon flooding that they see there. So over the last century, the water level in Jamaica Bay, as measured by the nearest tide gauge, has risen nearly a foot, owing to both sea level rise and a certain amount of subsidence of the land. Minor flooding events in the Broad Channel area now occur once or twice a month or more. And here is a quote from Dan Mundy, which we actually included in our report. Moving down to Savannah and Tybee Island. This is Tybee Island during tidal flooding. Floods in the Savannah area now occur about 10 times a year, up from 5 or fewer some 40 years ago. Among the other impact, this island is served by a single highway, Highway 80, which has become particularly prone to tidal flooding and even closure during a full or new moon tide. And here's just a quote from Tybee Island's longtime city councilor, Paul Wolf. briefly moving to Charleston, this is tidal flooding from last month, September. So sea level at Charleston has risen by more than 5 inches over the last 40 years, and the number of tidal floods has increased steadily. So today the tides cause about 24 tidal flood events a year, and that translates roughly into what you see here, tidal flooding on roughly 12 days each year. Driving these historic changes is the global rise in sea level. We've seen roughly 8 inches globally since 1880, and we know that today that rate is accelerating. So, how will tidal flooding respond? Providing that answer is what our report tries to do. So we can talk in detail about our methods, about what we did more specifically in the Q&A if folks are interested, and in follow-up conversations, but just as an overview. So we looked at 52 locations on the east and Gulf Coast using 52 Noaa tide gauges. We would have loved to look at many, many more locations, but we were limited by the number of tide gauges with data that we could use. We used local, minor, and moderate flooding thresholds established by the local weather forecasting offices, and we correlated those with the actual onset of local flooding. We used the National Climate Assessment sea level rise projections for 2030 and 2045, and we used localized projections developed by Climate Central that really capture what's happening with local geology, subsidence, currents, and so forth, to really capture the variability in sea level rise up and down our coasts. And then we projected the frequency and the duration with which future tides would exceed flooding thresholds. So how often will they happen? How long will they last? And maybe most importantly, we really tried to share stories about communities' experiences so that this wouldn't be a long list of data. This would really connect to what's happening in places today and look forward and ask what communities can do about this. So to share the results with you, I'm going to pass it off now to my colleague, Melanie Fitzpatrick.
Thanks, Erica, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to dig into the data and the findings. As Erica said, we know that sea level is rising. We've seen about an 8-inch rise over the last century, but places like Annapolis have seen a lot more. So there's been a 15-inch rise in Annapolis. This is a slide showing the Noaa tide gauges and what that historic sea level rise looks like, and how we've now replaced it from what's called satellite altimeter data. So we have very high resolution satellite data that's now also able to measure the same rate of increase, and you can see that it is rising faster than ever before. We know that the tides are also changing, and there's two reasons really. Firstly, they're having greater impact because we have heavily developed shores, and secondly, they're occurring on top of this elevated and now rising sea level. We know that global warming is responsible for this. We're accelerating the melting of land-based ice into the ocean, and seawater is also expanding, so it's absorbing heat from the atmosphere and expanding. In the report, we looked at some of the historical changes, and we also used some Noaa data that shows that for some places over the last 40 years, as Erica mentioned, the flooding has quadrupled or even greater increase. And so this just shows you some places that we studied. Norfolk, Atlantic City, Charleston, Boston are all dealing with these increasing tidal floods. And also, as Erica mentioned, there are local variations in each place, and it's due to the land sinking, to groundwater extraction, and to currents changing off the coast. So what we've done in the report is we've taken two measures, minor and moderate flooding, and many of you would be familiar with those. This is a readout for just a short period of time from one of the locations, showing how the tides go in and out and how they're quite variable. But when they reach a certain water level, an advisory is issued. It's called an advisory, a coastal flood advisory for minor flooding. When tides hit another level, it's called a coastal flood warning. Now, most coastal flood warnings that are moderate or extensive only occur these days with some kind of storm activity, even if it's far off the coast or if it's a local storm or a hurricane. Moderate floods are very rare if they're just from tides, and we're going to show that that's going to change in the future. So about twice a month during new and full moons, the Earth, the Sun and the Moon align, and that's when we get the biggest tides. So there's a greater force on the Earth's ocean, and the tides become slightly higher than normal twice a month. But several times a year during this new or full moon, when the moon is closest to the Earth, the range of the tides is even greater. And that's what we've experienced the last few days. These are Perigean spring tides, colloquially called king tides. And we know that that's been happening over the last few days and providing a lot of flooding in a lot of places. When we looked at these different levels, the moderate and the minor flooding, we found that because of rising seas, that tidal flooding will not only occur more often, but it will also reach further inland. And tidal flooding is expected to occur more often and cause more disruption. So you can see in this little diagram here that today a minor flood is really, it's a nuisance. We call them nuisance floods, and that's shown with that little white arrow. But as you increase higher sea level, so you put sea level rise on top, you're actually allowing that water to go further inland. So you can see by 2045, with a certain amount of sea level, these floods are expected to become more common simply from the high tides without any storm activity. So the sea level